The stench of death hung thick in the humid Guadalcanal air on October 24, 1942, mixing with the smell of gunpowder, blood, and rotting jungle vegetation. Sergeant John Basilone crouched behind his Browning M1917 machine gun, his hands already stained with gun oil and the residue of countless rounds fired into the darkness. The insects were relentless, their buzzing a constant backdrop to the occasional crack of rifle fire in the distance. But Basilone wasn't thinking about the mosquitoes or the oppressive heat. His mind was locked onto the tree line ahead, where shadows moved with purpose, where the enemy waited for the cover of complete darkness to launch what would become one of the most ferocious assaults of the Pacific War. The Solomon Islands campaign had been brutal from the start. Since the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August, they'd been locked in a vicious struggle for control of Henderson Field, the strategic airstrip that could tip the balance of power in the Pacific. The Japanese were desperate to reclaim it, throwing wave after wave of soldiers against the American positions. But nothing could have prepared the defenders for what was about to unfold over the next 72 hours. A nightmare of relentless combat that would forge one man's legend and earn him the Medal of Honor. John Basilone, a former Army soldier who had served in the Philippines before joining the Marines, was about to face the greatest test of his life, and in doing so, demonstrate a level of courage and combat effectiveness that would become the stuff of military legend. The son of Italian immigrants, Basilone had grown up in Raritan, New Jersey, where his father worked as a tailor. He was one of 10 children, raised in a tight-knit Catholic household where hard work and family loyalty were fundamental values. Like many young men of his generation, Basilone had struggled to find his place in Depression-era America. He'd worked as a caddy and a truck driver before enlisting in the Army in 1934, seeking adventure and a steady paycheck. His 3 years in the Philippines had given him his first taste of military life and the exotic East. But when he returned to civilian life in 1937, he found himself restless and unfulfilled. The peacetime jobs felt meaningless after the structure and purpose of military service. So in 1940, with war clouds gathering over Europe and Asia, Basilone made the decision that would define his life. He joined the United States Marine Corps. The Marines transformed him. The rigorous training, the emphasis on marksmanship and aggression, the brotherhood of the Corps, all of it resonated with something deep in Basilone's character. He excelled with the machine gun, demonstrating not just accuracy but an intuitive understanding of the weapon's capabilities and limitations. His instructors noted his calm under pressure, his ability to maintain fire discipline when others might panic and waste ammunition. But more than technical skill, Basilone possessed that indefinable quality that separates good soldiers from great ones, an absolute refusal to quit, a willingness to keep fighting when every rational instinct screams for retreat or surrender. He would need every ounce of that determination on Guadalcanal. By October 1942, the situation on Guadalcanal had reached a critical point. The Japanese had reinforced their garrison substantially, and intelligence suggested a major offensive was imminent. The Marines were stretched thin, defending a perimeter around Henderson Field that seemed to grow more vulnerable with each passing day. Basilone's unit, the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, was positioned along the Lunga River, in an area that would come to be known simply as the Ridge. It was a relatively exposed position, with jungle pressing close on 3 sides and only a thin line of foxholes and machine gun nests between the defenders and the enemy. The men knew something big was coming. You could feel it in the air, that electric tension that precedes combat, when every sound seems magnified and every shadow might conceal death. On the night of October 24th, that tension exploded into violence. The Japanese attack began with artillery fire, shells screaming out of the darkness to burst among the Marine positions. Then came the infantry, hundreds of soldiers emerging from the jungle, their voices raised in battle cries as they charged toward the American lines. The Marines opened fire, machine guns hammering away at the advancing enemy, rifles cracking in the darkness illuminated only by muzzle flashes and the occasional flare. Basilone was in his element, controlling his gun with practiced efficiency, firing disciplined bursts that cut through the attacking waves. But this wasn't just another probe or limited assault. This was the beginning of a sustained offensive that would test the Marines to their absolute limits. The fighting that first night was intense but manageable. The Japanese attacked in waves, and the Marines threw them back each time, leaving corpses piled in front of the American positions. But with each repulsed attack, the situation grew more desperate. Ammunition began to run low. Men were wounded, pulled back from the line to receive what medical care was available in the chaos. And the Japanese kept coming, seemingly inexhaustible, pressing forward despite horrific casualties. As dawn broke on October 25th, Basilone surveyed the carnage in front of his position. Bodies were everywhere, some only yards from his gun. The jungle stank of death, and flies were already gathering in the tropical heat. But there was no time to rest. Everyone knew the Japanese would attack again as soon as darkness fell. Throughout the day, Basilone worked feverishly to prepare for the coming night. He cleaned his guns, checked his ammunition supplies, and coordinated with the other machine gun crews in his section. Water and rations were scarce, but that was secondary to ensuring the weapons would function when needed. Other Marines dug their foxholes deeper, reinforced positions, and tried to catch a few hours of sleep in the sweltering heat. The wounded were evacuated when possible, but many remained on the line, too valuable to spare. The perimeter was simply too thin, the manpower too limited. Every able-bodied Marine, and some who weren't so able-bodied, would be needed when night fell. The second night brought renewed fury. The Japanese attacked with even greater determination, having realized that the American position was vulnerable. Artillery preparation was more intense, the infantry assaults more coordinated. And this time, they broke through in several places, forcing savage hand-to-hand combat as Marines fought to contain the penetrations. Basilone found himself in an impossible situation. His gun was one of the few still firing effectively, but he was running critically low on ammunition. The supply lines had been disrupted by the Japanese breakthrough, and getting ammunition forward to the guns was nearly impossible under the intense fire. Men attempting to bring up ammunition were cut down before they could reach the forward positions. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. It was then that Basilone made the decision that would define his legend. But ammunition wasn't the only problem. The guns themselves were overheating from sustained firing, a potentially catastrophic situation. A machine gun that overheats can jam, or even damage itself permanently, rendering it useless at the moment it's most needed. Basilone solved this problem with characteristic ingenuity and complete disregard for his own safety. When one gun threatened to fail from overheating, he urinated on the barrel to cool it down, a crude but effective field expedient that kept the weapon in action. When that wasn't enough, he worked with the gun's superheated metal with his bare hands, suffering severe burns as he cleared jams and made adjustments. The pain must have been excruciating, but Basilone showed no sign of it, focused entirely on keeping his guns firing. As the night wore on, the situation became even more desperate. 2 of the machine gun crews in Basilone's section were completely wiped out, killed or too severely wounded to continue fighting. Their guns fell silent, creating dangerous gaps in the defensive line that the Japanese immediately sought to exploit. Again, Basilone refused to accept defeat. He moved from position to position, sometimes carrying one of the Browning machine guns himself, an incredible feat given that the weapon weighed over 100 pounds with its tripod and water jacket. He would set up in a position, fire devastating bursts into the attacking Japanese, then move to another threatened point in the line. He became ubiquitous, seeming to be everywhere at once, his guns hammering away at the enemy whenever they threatened to overwhelm the Marine defenses. The Japanese soldiers facing Basilone that night displayed their own brand of ferocious courage. They kept coming despite catastrophic losses, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades to press home their attacks. Some came so close that Basilone killed them with his pistol when there wasn't time to swing the machine gun around. Others he dispatched with his caber knife in brutal close-quarters struggles. The line between heroism and desperation blurred in the darkness, both sides fighting with a savagery born of absolute necessity. For the Japanese, capturing Henderson Field was a strategic imperative. For the Marines, holding the line meant survival, not just for themselves but for the entire Guadalcanal campaign. By the morning of October 26th, Basilone had been fighting almost continuously for over 36 hours. He was exhausted, burned, and covered in the filth of battle, but the enemy kept coming. The third night loomed ahead, and everyone knew it would bring another round of attacks. The Marines were at their breaking point, low on ammunition, food, and water, many wounded, all exhausted beyond anything they'd experienced before. But they had no choice but to hold. There was no rear area to fall back to, no reserve position prepared. The ridge had to hold, or Henderson Field would fall, and with it, potentially the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The third night was the worst. The Japanese, recognizing that this might be their last chance to break through before American reinforcements arrived, threw everything they had at the Marine positions. The attacks were continuous, wave after wave of soldiers screaming out of the jungle, attacking with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. The noise was incredible, deafening, a continuous roar of gunfire, explosions, and human voices raised in rage and fear. Basilone, now commanding what remained of his section with most of the NCOs dead or wounded, moved constantly along the line, directing fire, encouraging his men, and manning the guns himself, when necessary. At one point during that hellish night, Japanese soldiers overran part of the position, forcing Basilone into close combat. He killed several with his pistol before it ran dry, then grabbed a Japanese rifle from a fallen soldier and used it as a club. Other Marines rallied to him, and together they drove the enemy back in a savage melee that left bodies piled in the foxholes. Basilone then returned to his machine gun as if nothing unusual had happened, methodically feeding belt after belt through the weapon, cutting down the next wave of attackers. His clothes were in tatters, his hands were burned and bleeding, but his gun kept firing, its steady hammering rhythm a source of comfort and encouragement to the Marines around him. Throughout that third night, Basilone's actions went beyond courage into something almost superhuman. When one of his guns was destroyed by a Japanese mortar round, he physically dragged another gun forward to fill the gap, setting it up under intense fire, and immediately beginning to engage the enemy. When an ammunition bearer was killed just yards from his position, Basilone crawled out under fire to retrieve the ammunition belts, dragging them back to his gun while bullets kicked up dirt around him. When communication with the command post was severed, he made the journey himself to report on the situation and request more ammunition, running through a gauntlet of enemy fire that should have killed him but somehow didn't. His men, watching their sergeant perform these impossible feats, found their own courage renewed. If Basilone could keep fighting, they could keep fighting. His example was infectious, turning a desperate defense into something more, a determined stand that gradually began to break the will of the attackers. The Japanese had expected to overwhelm the American positions through sheer weight of numbers and ferocity, but they hadn't counted on men like John Basilone, who simply refused to be beaten. Every time they thought they'd created a gap in the line, Basilone would appear with his machine gun, pouring devastating fire into their ranks. Every time they thought the Americans must be out of ammunition, another belt would feed through Basilone's gun, cutting down another squad of attackers. By dawn on October 27th, the Japanese offensive had spent itself. The ground in front of the Marine positions was carpeted with bodies. Estimates would later place Japanese casualties at around 2,000 killed in the three-day battle, with many more wounded. The Marines had held, though at terrible cost. Of the 15 men in Basilone's machine gun section, only 2 besides himself were still able to fight. But they had held. Henderson Field remained in American hands, and the Japanese would never again mount an offensive of such scale on Guadalcanal. The tide had turned, though few realized it at the time. In the aftermath of the battle, as the full scale of what had happened became clear, Basilone's superiors recognized that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Reports filtered up the chain of command describing Basilone's actions during those 72 hours of hell. The ammunition runs under fire, the hand-to-hand combat, the moving of machine guns to threaten positions, the absolute refusal to quit even when the situation seemed hopeless. When Marines from other units arrived to reinforce the position and saw the carnage, saw the piles of Japanese dead in front of Basilone's guns, they could hardly believe that such a small force had inflicted such casualties and held against such odds. The Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, was awarded to Basilone for his actions at Guadalcanal. The citation spoke of his heroic conduct above and beyond the call of duty, and his extraordinary courage and devotion to duty. But those formal words could never fully capture what he had done, the multiple acts of individual heroism compressed into 3 days of continuous combat. Basilone had not performed one great heroic action but dozens of them, each one worthy of recognition, each one carried out when he was exhausted, wounded, and had every reason to fall back or give up. He had quite literally held the line through force of will and skill with his weapons. But Basilone's war was far from over. He could have stayed in the United States after Guadalcanal, touring the country to promote war bonds and boost morale, and for a time he did. The Marine Corps, recognizing his value as a symbol and a hero, brought him home to be celebrated. He was featured in newspapers and newsreels, met with celebrities and politicians, and became one of the most famous Marines in America. Women swooned over him, the handsome sergeant with the Medal of Honor and the easy smile. He could have spent the rest of the war safe from harm, living as a hero while others did the fighting. But that wasn't John Basilone. The celebrity and acclaim made him uncomfortable. He felt like a fraud, accepting praise while his fellow Marines continued to fight and die in the Pacific. He requested to return to combat, turning down a commission as an officer and a comfortable training assignment to go back to the war. The Marine Corps initially resisted, not wanting to risk losing such a powerful propaganda asset, but Basilone was insistent. He belonged with his men, he said, not selling bonds to civilians who could never understand what it meant to hold a position against impossible odds. Eventually, the Marine Corps relented, and Basilone got his wish. He was assigned to the 5th Marine Division, training for the invasion of Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1945, Basilone waded ashore on Iwo Jima as part of the first assault wave. The beach was a nightmare, black volcanic sand that men sank into, making movement difficult and offering little cover. Japanese fortifications on the heights overlooking the beach poured fire into the Marines, machine guns, mortars, and artillery turning the beach into a killing ground. Men were falling everywhere, cut down before they could even get off the beach. The carefully planned assault was dissolving into chaos as units became disorganized, leaders were killed, and the intensity of the Japanese fire paralyzed forward movement. Once again, Basilone stepped up. He led a team through the Japanese minefield that had been laid just off the beach, guiding Marines through the deadly obstacle while under intense fire. Then, when his unit became pinned down by a Japanese blockhouse, Basilone single-handedly assaulted the position with grenades and demolition charges, destroying it and allowing his unit to advance. He was moving forward, urging his men on, doing what he had always done, leading from the front and inspiring those around him with his courage. But even John Basilone's luck had limits. A Japanese mortar round landed near Basilone as he moved across the open ground. The explosion killed him instantly, along with 4 other Marines. He was 30 years old. The man who had survived 3 days of hell at Guadalcanal, who had killed hundreds of enemy soldiers and performed impossible feats of valor, died in the opening hours of the Iwo Jima campaign. His body was recovered and eventually buried in Arlington National Cemetery, his grave marked by a simple white headstone that bears his name, rank, and the words, Medal of Honor. The loss of John Basilone was felt throughout the Marine Corps. He had become more than just a soldier. He was a symbol of Marine Corps values, courage, aggression, and never giving up no matter the odds. His story was told to new Marines in training, held up as an example of what one determined individual could accomplish in combat. But more than that, Basilone represented something fundamental about the American fighting man in World War II. Ordinary men from ordinary backgrounds who rose to extraordinary heights when their country needed them. Today, Basilone's legacy endures. A Navy destroyer was named in his honor, the USS Basilone, serving with distinction before being decommissioned. His hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, holds an annual parade in his memory, celebrating the local boy who became a national hero. The stretch of road running through the town has been renamed in his honor. Marine Corps bases have buildings and facilities named after him. His story has been told in books, documentaries, and most recently in the HBO miniseries, The Pacific, which dramatized his actions at Guadalcanal and his death on Iwo Jima, introducing a new generation to his legend. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to John Basilone is the way his example continues to inspire. Young Marines today learn about Manila John, the nickname his fellow Marines gave him in honor of his Army service in the Philippines. They learn about the 3 days on Guadalcanal when one Marine sergeant with machine guns held back thousands of Japanese soldiers. They learn about his refusal to take the easy path, his insistence on returning to combat when he could have stayed safe at home. They learn that heroism isn't about being fearless but about doing your duty despite fear, about continuing to fight when every rational instinct tells you to quit, about leading others through your example rather than your words. The numbers associated with Basilone's stand at Guadalcanal are staggering. 2,000 Japanese soldiers killed over 3 days, most of them falling to machine gun fire in front of a position held by fewer than 20 Marines at the start of the battle, and only 3 by the end. Countless ammunition runs made under fire, multiple machine guns moved and operated, close combat engagements won through sheer determination and skill. But numbers can't capture the full story. They can't convey the exhaustion, the fear, the pain of burned hands operating superheated weapons, the weight of responsibility for the men around you, the decision to stay and fight when falling back would have been justifiable. What John Basilone accomplished in those 72 hours on Guadalcanal transcends mere statistics. He demonstrated what is possible when training, courage, and determination combine in one individual at a critical moment. He showed that battles are won not just by superior numbers or better equipment, but by individuals willing to do whatever is necessary to accomplish the mission. He proved that leadership is about action, not words, about doing the hard things yourself rather than ordering others to do them. These are timeless lessons, as relevant today as they were in 1942. The machine gun positions Basilone held on the ridge at Guadalcanal are gone now, reclaimed by the jungle that briefly receded before the violence of war. The bodies that once carpeted the ground have long since turned to dust. Henderson Field, the strategic prize that so many died to capture or defend, is now Honiara International Airport, serving civilian aircraft rather than military fighters. The jungle has healed, leaving little trace of the savage battle that raged there for 3 days in October 1942. But the memory of what happened there endures, preserved in Marine Corps history, and in the story of one sergeant who refused to let his position fall. John Basilone never sought glory or recognition. He was, by all accounts, a humble man who saw himself as simply doing his job, doing what any Marine would do in his position. When awarded the Medal of Honor, he expressed embarrassment at being singled out when so many others had fought just as bravely. When brought home for the war bond tour, he chafed at the celebrity, uncomfortable with being treated as special when his friends and fellow Marines remained in combat. And when given the chance to return to combat, he took it without hesitation, knowing the risks but unable to remain safe while others fought. That humility, that sense of duty, is perhaps what makes his story so compelling. He was a hero who never saw himself as one, a warrior who fought because it needed to be done, not for recognition or reward. The cost of Basilone's heroism was ultimately his life. He survived Guadalcanal only to die on Iwo Jima, giving everything in service to his country and his corps. But in those 30 years of life, he accomplished more than most men could in a century. He became a symbol of courage and determination, an inspiration to generations of Marines who followed him. He showed that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. He proved that one individual can make a difference, can turn the tide of battle through courage and skill and an absolute refusal to quit. These are the lessons of John Basilone's life and the legacy that ensures his story will be told as long as there are Marines to tell it.